Hello and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. This is a little bit of an earlier presentation, largely because I had to work around getting Hedley Rees on with me. Now, listen, I spoke with Hedley in early 2021. This was just after the vaccine rollout had occurred. And at that time, he had concerns about what was happening and some of the risks that could occur. And his expertise in the pharmaceutical industry was extremely valuable at the time. And since that period of time, Hedley has remained consistently raising the voice about what challenges are ahead and where there are problems. And in truth, he is very scary to the industry because he knows so much. There's nothing worse than somebody who has a great understanding of the industry and who is willing to speak out when things are not quite right. And so I have a tremendous pleasure to have with me here Hedley. I'll pop you on here. How are you, Hedley? If you can just unmute for me.
Hi, Philip. I'm well, thank you, and it's so good to be on your show. Uh, it,
Excellent.
I enjoyed speaking with you the first time, and I think I'm going to enjoy it even more this time.
So listen, Hedley, give us an introduction about yourself, your background, and so on, so people understand who you are and what you're about.
Okay, well, in 1980, I joined Big Pharma. I joined Bayer in the UK. So I learned all the manufacturing and distribution aspects because this was a manufacturing plant and we used to ship products all over the world. We used to ship Alka-Seltzer to the whole of Europe. We made sterile injectables. We made topical creams and ointments. So over 16 years, I moved through the rank to be head of supply chain at the end of it. And then I moved into biotech after doing an MBA at Cranfield University. And in biotech, very different environment. So it's very much about early stage drug development moving forward. So I learned all the disciplines that were part of the drug development process, like pharmacodynamics, uh, um, toxicology. I didn't understand it all, but I knew what had to be done to bring a drug to market, and I can say more about that subsequently. In 2005, I left well, I didn't leave the industry, but I became an independent consultant, set up a business called PharmaFlow, which specializes in helping companies build clinical trial and commercial supply chains and even preclinical supply chains. And over that time, I've had so many clients and worked with so many drug developers that I've really built up a bank of knowledge and information. And in 2011, Wiley in the US asked me to write a book called Supply Chain Management in the Drug Industry. You should be able to see a little bit of it behind my head there. And as I say, that published in 2011. It's a 450-page textbook on everything about the industry of drug development. And I had 30 expert witnesses as well join me to give their views on various aspects. And that sold in 35 countries. And it really was well received by what I would call the sort of early adopters in the industry, people who wanted to see change. Unfortunately, there were less of those than you would expect. And so I've been writing articles. I'm pretty prolific in the industry in terms of writing articles and having them published. And as it happens, only in the last month or so, Wiley have come back to me and said, "Look, we like what you're doing. Will you write another book?" Which hopefully I'll be starting to do fairly soon. I have made a good start anyway, and that's going to be tentatively called a systems-based approach to transforming the pharmaceutical supply chain, uh, replacing patents with patients. So that's me in a nutshell.
Excellent, excellent, Hedley. Now, listen, I want to ask you this question because as I was listening to you talk about this is your business, this is part of your industry. Wouldn't it just have been easier for you to stay silent? Why have you chosen to continue to speak, even in the face of censorship? Because you were taken off LinkedIn as well for being too much of an expert.
Yes, indeed. But I was doing this inside the industry. I was well known in the industry as being a modernizer, calling for change. So after writing that book, I basically went around the Western world, San Francisco, Cincinnati, Denmark, Switzerland, giving my talk on how drugs or how the industry had lost its way. It was focusing on patents rather than on the patients and healthcare professionals they should have been serving. There's no industry in the world that survives in the long term if it doesn't provide value for money for it, the people using its products. And the industry has been delinquent on that for many, many years.
Mm,
And I explained that the outsourcing that's taken place, the move, what they call offshore to China and India to buy products and materials, and the various other retrenching from their customers, because now the pharma industry doesn't service its customers. That's all done by wholesalers. So I was saying that and writing articles that were published in Chemistry Today, in the Pharmaceutical Journal, and people were nodding their head and saying, yes, yes, you're quite right. But at the meantime, at the top level of the industry, as far as I can see, there wasn't the sort of eagerness for change.
mm.
So I just kept on doing what I was doing before, basically.
I know, but you have taken a point where, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, you are making very strong statements. And I'm going to highlight now for anybody who is interested. He does have a very fascinating and detailed Substack here. This is Inside Pharma. And you can see as I scroll down through it, he is taking on some very big stuff, especially around in terms of vaccines and in terms of big pharma and so on. And this is what I'm asking you, is that so much of the pharmaceutical industry, based on my observation, has largely been silent. What is, how do you explain that? Why is it only one or two voices that seem to be raising any questions? What's the reason for that?
Well, I basically think that no one is incentivized to do it. The whole industry is incentivized to continue with the status quo, which is for uh, the the model that's used at the moment, which I call find it, file it, flog it. I've given it a sort of funny name to hopefully help people understand. But the way the industry works is it finds a molecule and patents it. Now, it could be a small molecule chemical, or it could be a biologic, which are giant big molecules. But once the patent's in place, the clock starts ticking. Fundamentally, there's 20 years patent cover before the patent expires. So the next stage is what I call, uh, sorry, I just find it. Oh, so yeah, sorry, I forgot my own book here. Find it, file it, which is go for regulatory approval, which basically means developing the drugs from early stage development right the way through to submitting an application to market the drug. And once it gets approved, the flog it stage is basically sales and marketing goes in, and it makes the drug a success based on the skills of sales and marketing. But what you have to remember is that the industry, the bit well, there was never such a thing as big pharma when we go back to 1980. There was only large pharmaceutical companies, and they had the critical mass to develop drugs. They employed the people, they owned the facilities, they made everything themselves. Just about, they're highly vertically integrated. And over the last 40 years, that vertical integration has disappeared. And now we've got a highly fragmented industry. And the manufacturers are now contract manufacturers, because people and companies bought up the facilities that had been sold, and they employed the people that had been let go, and they became contractors. And now all the work, all the hard yards, all the physical work is done by contractors. Now, and they work on a fee for service basis. So they get paid for help for developing the drug because they've got the skills. Of course, one of the unfortunate consequences is over 40 years, they've become in the power position. A drug won't get to market unless it's properly uh, developed and all the application it takes place. And the industry, the big pharmas have to pay for that. Now, that is not a wonderful position to be in when you are the buyer and your suppliers, your contractors, hold all the cards. So,
I just want to pause you at this point when you say that. So I want to take this now into what you've said into the world that we are now. Explain to me then what is the connection between Pfizer and BioNTech? Because we say the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, mRNA vaccine. What is the connection there?
well, BioNTech would be classed as a typical biotech company. Biotech means the company's been funded by venture capital or some other uh, capital to get a drug maybe into safety testing and maybe the initial stages of clinical trials. Then they sell on to a big pharma company and take the money, and then their investors make an exit. That's always been the case. And the companies I worked for before this, that's what they did. Now, you need to be of a certain size and critical mass to be able to take the drug to market. And, you know, BioNTech is of a size where it just does not have that critical mass. However, it still submitted the application to run clinical trials, and it also submitted the application to market the drug. Now, in my experience, a company of that size could never do that. But we do know that Pfizer, a plant of Pfizer's in Andover, Massachusetts, made the initial batches that were used and that were subsequently identified as substandard with a high level of side effects. And that's been reported in numbers and cases. And I've looked at that plant, and it's a research and development plant. It's not capable of making to what they call good manufacturing practice.
Oh, just before you go on a bit further there, because you said something there that I'm trying to get my head around. This is in relation to the fact that it was identified in some, when they were looking at side effects across the world, that specific batches seem to have significantly higher side effects than other batches. Is this what you're making reference to?
Yes, indeed. Good manufacturing practice has been in place for 40, 50 years, and it's very detailed. I can show you. This is this is the UK's guide. It's rather thick, as you can see, and these are all the procedures and the protocols that have to be followed when you develop a drug, so that patients are kept safe. There'll be equivalents in the airline industry. There'll be equivalents in the automotive industry. Anyone who works in industry realizes that quality systems, that people need to know what they're doing, they need to be trained, and they need to have the proper equipment and the proper layouts and all these things. And it's documented in that book. But when facilities are being used that haven't got that accreditation, and we know the first Pfizer batches did not have that accreditation, then you're going to harm, even kill people. Uh, whenever any industry does not stick to its protocols, its quality systems, then the products are going to be defective. You know that.
Do we have any examples where that has occurred and what has come out of it?
Well, we know in 2007, 2008, Baxter, a pharmaceutical company that was supplying heparin, a drug thinning agent, uh, they bought a toxic material in China, which was 100 times cheaper than the original material. And it was a bit like antifreeze that you put in your car. And they didn't pick it up. It went into their product, and hundreds of people died and thousands of people suffered adverse events. So we know, and that was known as an adulterated material. The authentic material had been substituted. And you can imagine companies are buying from China, a company based in the US or in Europe or whatever, they'll have a lot of difficulty actually picking up, all those thousands of miles away in a different culture if these things had happened. So that incident was written up by Pew Health, and it's well documented, and it led to the passing of the Falsified Medicines Directive in Europe, which meant that drug companies had to have full traceability of their materials from the start to the finished product going to patients. And that was passed in 2000 and 2011, and it's still not properly implemented. And the UK has just decided it doesn't need it for advanced therapies, which, in my opinion, is not a good thing. And similar act was passed in the US. So we knew then, we know now that the supply chain is absolutely crucial because that's what goes into the patient's body.
So when I listen to these things, and I'm trying to make sure I break this down for listeners, and I'm thinking of the kind of questions I think they would ask. One of the things that I have kept on seeing, and I had no answer for it, is that it is not possible to do 11 billion doses in this kind of period of time, even across multiple companies. You work in the supply chain industry. What would you say to that? Is that a reasonable
Well,
perspective?
I go a step before that, um, because when you develop a drug to get it approved, you start off with a small supply chain. Uh, to make product to go into animal models for testing. So you'd make 10 to 15 kilos or liters of the product. So you have to set up the small supply chain. So you have suppliers in there, and then they make these 15 kilos, and that is then sent to a contract research organization, and they're geared up. The ones that specialize in animal testings and technical toxicology, they're geared up to do the testing. So they test the drug, the compound in animal models. They then write up the studies, and maybe 3 months later, you get a report back saying, well, either this drug is not suitable to go into humans, or yes, it looks as if it's suitable. So, and typically that takes 3 years, and it's not just me saying that. The US Government Accountability Office report of 2006 confirmed that. So, and once you get successful safety data, you then apply to the regulators to run clinical trials in humans. And the first stage is safety studies in healthy volunteers. This is where you send the volunteers off to a center or whatever, where they've got beds and Game Boy, and they get bored, obviously. So the measures have to be taken for them not to get bored. But they have blood's taken, and they're dosed with the drug, and then that again is reported on by a contract research organization, and the decision then is taken whether to move to a phase two or not. Now,
So then, before you go, then, so how did warp speed work in the context of vaccine development? So they had to therefore take some shortcuts, and they had to bypass some systems. What was the difference in order to get this to market within about 9 months?
well, they only focused on the clinical studies. You can run a clinical study in 3 to 6 months, very limited clinical study, but you can't make the drug for safety testing in 3 or 6 months. It takes years by the time you get that tested. That's why it takes. So the manufacturing is the part that takes the longest, because you've got all these suppliers involved that you have to have contracts with, you have to have quality agreements with, which you have to negotiate. And that part of it comes under what they call chemistry, manufacturing and controls, which is a part, which is called the module 3, which you have to submit when you go for drug approvals. You have to tell the regulators every supplier you've used, every specification of every material, all your drug development protocols, the way you've made sure that what you've developed has been done properly, or the process validation, and all those things. And that goes into the dossier that you finally ask for approval. With these drugs, they determined that they invented something called a rolling review, which is completely different to the more orthodox way of going for drug approval. And they only looked at the clinical studies, and they said they combined them all together, all the phases together. If you do that, you're not doing the safety testing, because at each stage of clinical, you have to produce larger batches. And when you move to larger batches, you're scaling up. And when you scale up, you can change the composition of the compound. What was a safe molecule at 15 kilos might not be a safe molecule at 50 or 100 kilos. And what you have to do when you scale up, you have to re-perform the safety studies in animals. There are things called a polymorph, which is the molecular change. It's well known. And I've had clients who've had a safe drug in early development, and then at the latter stages of phase 2, they've had to stop because they've had a polymorph, which has turned the compound toxic. That's why, and it's not just scale up, it's any change to the process that takes place as you develop. And we know there was a change with the Pfizer drug between process 1 and process 2. That again should have gone through safety testing, because that change could change the molecular structure and make it toxic.
I want to ask you a question here, because I've found this is really complex stuff, but fascinating to try and understand. Can you explain to me, how does we're now going to focus specifically on the COVID vaccines, the mRNA technology, in terms of how it gets from zero to the vaccine delivered in someone? What are the steps, in a simple way, that are involved?
Right. Well, you have to source raw materials and starting materials. First of all, starting materials are the cells. Now, raw materials you can buy to the specification. You don't have to assure that it's been made to good distribution practice, but it has to meet the specification. So they can be tested, and if they pass the specification, they can be used. But once you get to starting materials, they all have to be manufactured to good distribution practice. So you'd order your raw materials, and they're typically on 3 to 6 months lead time. So that in itself makes you think, my gosh, this is almost the whole time of the development program. But with the starting materials, you have to visit the supplier, you have to audit them. You then, and that means you inspect them and you go through every detail of what they do. And this is an incredibly complex processing. It's biologic, so they are living things, very difficult to assure that they don't change just for, the environment has changed. So, and then you have to then set up your drug substance manufacturer, but you can't do that until you've got the starting materials. So now you're up to about a year of having to build up this stock. And then once you've got the drug substance, the active ingredient, then that has to, the drug product, the fill finish, can't start until the drug substance is there. And you have to order the vials, you have to order the stoppers, the aluminium seals, and all these thousands of things. And by now, it's probably 3 years before you actually getting up to a finished product. This is how it would be normally.
And
So
is this done in the same location?
no,
Because you
no.
so this is also so it also has to be so it's done in one facility somewhere, then move to another facility. How many times does it have to move before you get to a final vial that is ready for distribution to the public?
Okay. Yeah, well, the starter material, the cell line, will be made, and it's stored at minus 190 degrees, 93 degrees centigrade. It's stored in what they call a dry shipper, which is basically filled with liquid nitrogen. It's called dry because if it falls over, the liquid nitrogen doesn't fall out, which obviously you don't want. So that's shipped via air because these shelf lives are so long. They ship via air, so it goes through airports and in cargo holds and the whole thing. And then it gets to the drug substance manufacturer. When they receive it, they have to handle those cells very carefully. They have to be thawed, they have to be processed, and they have to be bagged up in big liquid on in liquid bags. And then again, you're talking about 6 to 9 months just to do that to make sure that it's safe. And at any point, we've still got live organisms in here, so at any point you could lose a batch, which you're always conscious of. And so then that's at one site. So and we know for the Moderna vaccine, the site of the drug substance was a company called Lonza in Switzerland, the biggest contract manufacturer in the world, been in the business a long time and not, I mean, and they know what they're doing, but they are working for the Biontech who are sponsoring the clinical trial. And Lonza then would ship to a company called Catalent Pharma Solutions, who are the second largest contract manufacturer in the world. They've got a site in Bloomington, which has been inspected by FDA, and the FDA publish all their inspections if they're on what they call a Form 483, and that particular inspection, if you look at it, it was basically the inspectors were saying basically there was a lack of control at the site, and I think any experienced person looking at that would say they should have. This was for the booster injection, the inspection. It should have been closed down, or at least until closed down until significant remediation work took place based on the observations that the inspectors had made. And then, of course, from Catalan, it was frozen down into bulk quantities of vials containing between 5 and 10 doses. I know for the Pfizer vaccines, we don't actually know who did well. We know through leaked documents, but we don't definitely know where the fill finish uh, um, was done for Pfizer. But we do know that they were shipped at minus 70 degrees C into vaccination centers, and the vaccination centers had to finish the manufacturing operation that hadn't been completed, which was thawing the vials in quantities of 195 vials with 5 doses in. They had to thaw them by putting the vials in a refrigerator at plus 2 to 8 degrees C and letting them thaw over time. But of course, you have to do freeze thaw studies when you thaw anything to prove that what you had at the start is the same as what you've got when you finish. And you
So
have to do,
I just
go on.
wanted to pause you on that point, Hedley. So I'm taking now a pulling back and objectively looking at this. Would you give the industry credit for the fact that they were able to actually pull this off, this very complex process across the world, And whilst they would say, yes, there were a few problems, but overall they managed to do this relatively well. Is that a reasonable position for them?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Um, well, I try and find analogies to, one of the analogies I use is that so you go to a football match and one side suddenly the player picks up the ball, he runs the length of the field and he throws the ball into the goal, and the referee blows and says goal. Now, you know, it's so different to the way the game should normally be played. You aren't allowed to pick it up, you have to kick it and do all this. So, what's happened is so different to the 40, 50 years of regulations in good manufacturing practice. The FDA have their own Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, which is based on the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which lays out in immense detail all the things these companies have to do when developing the drugs, manufacturing the drugs, and distributing the drugs. And I'm struggling to understand uh, any real areas where they have followed those rules, and they are legally enforceable. It's a code of federal regulation. So what puzzles me is why lawyers aren't able to say, these are well-known regulations. All the CFRs are laws. So why can't those companies, the Pfizer's and the Moderna's, be brought to court and say, look, you have broken pharmaceutical law? Uh, One thing I would say, I think there's too much focus on what happened in the US with the Department of Defense, because we know there were rogue contracts associated with that. But in the rest of the world, the military, I know, had little or no involvement in the distribution or any of this. All the contracts were set up between governments and the pharma companies.
And
And
this
I
is
think, go
this
on.
is one of the questions that I'm puzzling about, is that even if this occurred in the, say, the UK, even if it occurred in the US, every single country has their own regulators that follow these rules. How did that go past every regulator? This is what I'm trying to comprehend. Is everybody then aligned to this? And they agreed that you could run with the ball in your hand to score a goal. Have we ever seen that happen before?
I think what I have observed is there are numbers of duplicate bodies where there's been confusion of responsibilities. Now, we know the concept of a competent authority, in building, all these different, you have bodies that are responsible for certain areas of, or they've got delegated responsibility from government. Now, in the US, the delegated responsibility is given to the FDA. FDA is the competent authority for drugs and medical devices, etc. And each one of these bodies, it's the same in Sweden, Brazil. They're all competent authorities. But then we've got the CDC, which is involved in approving drugs, and committees that are involved in approving. That's never happened, in my experience, until very recently, where you've got numbers of fingers in the pie, if you like, when it comes to approving drugs. And then it goes to a vote. And, and in the UK, we had the SAGE group, who, again, have no legitimate role in approving drugs. Always been the MHRA. And suddenly they seem to be having a loud voice in approving or leading to the approval of the vaccine. So I think the public has been confused and unsure as to who to listen to. And we know MHRA are pushing, I've just gone out on the point of care manufacturing provisions that MHRA now are implementing, and I'm looking at that thinking, have they really thought this through? You know, doctors or pharmacists with a hospital, the pharmacy is the gatekeeper. So any medicine going into a hospital in the UK has to go through the pharmacy, and so they're the gatekeeper. Now the plan is for hospital pharmacies to be able to manufacture the what they call advanced therapy medicinal products, uh, and they are a mix of cell and gene therapies and tissue engineering, and they're mainly gene therapies. So the regulations have been changed now so that hospital pharmacies will be able to manufacture gene therapies themselves.
I'm not sure if I understand you there. Now, this is completely strange to me. So, what are you saying that hospitals in the UK will be able to manufacture?
Yeah, there's three networks being set up in the UK that are working on gene therapies, particularly therapies for blood cancers, what they call CAR T
Hmm.
therapies for rare blood cancers. And there's one in, well, I won't go into detail here, but it's a network that's been set up in the UK to coordinate. I can send you a link after, Philip, to
Yes.
coordinate gene therapies moving into the NHS. There's been a
Okay.
significant amount of work on it.
Yeah. So let me pause and ask a question here because I want to focus quite closely on something here. I'm going to say a statement and I want you to respond to it. My statement has been when I look at the new mRNA technology, and yes, you're right, it's the first time it's being used at scale in humans. When I look at my research around autoimmunity in COVID 19, my statement was I think that they may have shot themselves in the foot by using the technology with the wrong disease. So the technology may be fine. They've just picked the worst viral infection to try it out on. Is that an unreasonable perspective?
No, oh, absolutely. There's another bit of evidence that that's not the case. Um, there is a gene therapy in the market called Kymriah, produced by, sold by Novartis, large Swiss company. Now, it's a lentiviral vector. Now, the AstraZeneca vector was an adenovirus vector, but it's another gene therapy. We had two types of gene therapy: the mRNA, which was frozen, and the adenovirus, which actually was at +2 to +8 degrees C. So that could have gone into the distribution network. But that Novartis product, as I say, is called Kymriah, and it's um, it's on the market. It was approved by FDA in August 2017, and a company called Oxford Biomedica make it in Oxford. They also make the adenovirus vector. And if you look at the side effects for Kymriah, the main side effects are neurological toxicities and cytokine storm, cytokine release syndrome. So there is a warning on the patient information leaflet, and the whole thing has to be carefully managed. And so, what I'm saying is, these gene therapies are very, very early stage, and they have to be monitored extremely closely because every patient is different. And in these blood cancers, these patients are very ill. So, if you get it wrong, they could pass away as part of as they're going through the therapy. The other thing, go on, sorry.
Yes, it raised the point as I'm going to be sharing now one of your points as you mentioned that with regards to the outcomes because you have here one of your articles about the big pharma's cover up of COVID shot deaths. Now, many would argue and I'll let people be able to take a look at that themselves when they, I think they'd have to go to your site to do it. But many would argue that the issues around excess deaths that are occurring, we just don't quite know exactly where they're occurring from. And the fact that we've had lots of yellow card incidents in the UK and there's severes in the US, you seem to think that this is being covered up. Why would you think so?
Well, the first thing to say, I go back to the regulations as well, but the yellow card system and theirs, they are backup systems, they're additional systems. The primary responsibility is on the pharmaceutical company that's selling the drug to exercise pharmacovigilance. So they have to have a process in place where within 24 hours, if they have a report of a serious adverse event, it's investigated, and they have to come up with a root cause and then make adjustments. And potentially it could mean they have to volunteer to, they have to recall the product, but the onus is on them to actually take action on any serious adverse event takes place. And in Europe, they have to have what they call a QPPV, a qualified person for pharmacovigilance, whose responsibility is to make sure that happens. The role of the regulator is to inspect those companies to make sure their pharmacovigilant processes are effective and working. Their role isn't really to collect the monitoring medicines is part of it, but they aren't going to be understand what's going on with a serious adverse event if they haven't developed the drug. It's for the company to do that. Now, why aren't they doing it? And I used the Toyota foot pedal incident, Philip, when I spoke to you earlier. I don't know if people will remember, but Toyota had an incident with their cars where there were problems with the brake pedal being reported. And the CEO of Toyota in the UK came on TV and said, look, we're on it. Trust us, we're going to solve it. And very quickly, they investigated and they found out that dealers had been putting mats on the floor that were contributing to these incidents. So it wasn't the foot pedal design or the car design. It was something that had been introduced by the car dealers, and instantly it stopped. Now, and if this was an aircraft, an air crash, airline crash, Boeing, Airbus, all the McDonnell Douglas, all these companies would be the first to the scene, and they'd be making sure that they found what the issue was and were resolving it, because they'd be losing customers otherwise. So you have to ask yourself, why have not the companies who've got the legal requirement to do that not been doing it? And because they don't want to know about what they would find out, you could
So
say.
this, yeah, so this is where it comes to the title of what I've been talking about. The pharmaceutical industry has the as a whole, I'm not talking about any of the major vaccine manufacturers, but as a whole, if this comes and it turns out that this was pharmacovigilance failure, that is going to impact the whole industry. And this is now what I can't understand. For companies that are not involved, why would they be selectively silent? Why would they not be like you, calling out and saying, listen, guys, this is normal standards. Why is it not being done?
I just think this is a symptom of a broken system. The system is broken, the whole drug development system. The big pharma companies have become so fragmented, and basically, I say big pharma has gone from a fulsome plum to a dried up prune. That's one of the sort of little metaphors I've tried to use to explain it. But big pharma isn't big anymore. They are just a collection of business people, uh, and if you go on to any of the biotech company website, you'll see pictures of about 10 or 15 people in suits with ties, who are running these companies, tiny companies, and they're claiming they're going to bring drugs to market, and that isn't going to happen. So the company now has got a huge contract base, which is calling the shots because they're the ones who can develop the drugs. You've got the big pharma companies who only do the discovery, which is molecular modeling, and molecular modeling itself is just a guess. So the statistics tell us that for every 10,000 molecules that are discovered and patented, only one gets to market. So, and out of every 250 drugs that are candidates go into development, only one gets to market.
So
Five get
does
into
so
clinical
does
trials.
the go ahead. Sorry, finish that
So
point.
I was going to say, so the attrition is enormous. So the claim that it costs $2.6 billion to develop a drug may well be right, but $2 billion plus is on the cutting room floor. Is the cost of failure.
So this then raises this point, and I'm bringing this up again. You said here, when, not if, Big Pharma collapses, the domino effect on financial markets will be immense. What were you talking about here? And does this have anything to do with where we are in the pandemic?
Yes, it does. Well, why I say that, because I've been following this a long time. As patents have been followed as the route to riches, if you like, if you could describe it that way. And so the focus has not been on the physical supply chain and the development process that adds value and develops the proper drugs. So the industry has become so fragmented that it actually can't develop drugs anymore without spending huge amounts of money with the contractors and its suppliers. And uh, you can only defy gravity for so long. Mother Nature eventually brings you back down to earth. So if you outsource your whole ability to develop products, eventually you aren't going to be able to satisfy your customers. And I think we're at a tipping point now where investors have been expecting. We look at Lipitor, the statin that I think lifetime sales about $37 billion. And that's heavily based on the ability to market and that whole thing. But as there's less and less blockbusters coming to market, because of the valley of death, which became the patent cliff, the industry's really struggled to keep investors happy. And I think it's coming out now in this that these are not genuine profits that are being made. They are profits that are being made on a wing and a prayer. And people are beginning to realize that's the case. And, there will be a domino effect once, say, Pfizer, someone found out that the whatever's been going on, it gets to court and a judge rules that, Pfizer have been delinquent and they stop trading, then all the confidence in the whole of Big Pharma will be gone. And it's not just Big Pharma, it's the suppliers, it's the Lonzas, it's the Catalan Pharma Solution. They are big companies on the stock market. Everyone makes a living from the big pharma companies because they've outsourced everything. So big pharma has to pay for every service it needs. So if big pharma goes down, all these companies on the stock markets will go down with them because their revenues will disappear overnight.
And this is exactly the question that I'm asking, and I'm genuinely baffled by it. At this stage of the pandemic, okay, let's pull back a bit. No one, I cannot think any scientist would have said that in January, February 2021, as we're rolling out the vaccines for the pandemic, that where we are now is where they expected us to be, where we're doing maybe the fifth or the sixth booster dose, the virus is still circulating. That cannot be the expectation of any investor or anyone who was even very strongly pro the vaccine. So that's the first part. The second part of the question is, at what point does the industry, the scientific community pause and say, okay, is there something that we have missed that needs to be addressed? And it seems as though we're in this limbo where there doesn't want to be an acknowledgement that maybe there is a problem. What really is going on?
Right. Well, you used the word there, scientific community. The amount of science in bringing drugs to market is pretty limited, to be honest. It's there in the early days, but the development of a drug is heavily dependent on the rest of STEM, technology, engineering, and maths. It's about the hard yards of converting an idea, a potential innovation into a product on the market. So it's the same as any other product. You need, you know, engineering, you need applied science, and there's so much pure science going on in the industry. But when you put an unknown substance into someone's body, no one can work out what the body's going to do to it, the biology of it. At the moment, scientists are saying, if we target this receptor and we do that, it'll cure that. A good example is Alzheimer's. In the last 15 years, there have been 30 failures in Alzheimer's disease. The science has been saying, this substance called amyloid beta or beta amyloid wraps itself around fibers in the brain, and that's what's doing it. There have been 30 late stage failures based on that theory. So there's hundreds of billions of dollars going down the pan. Pfizer have left also, these companies have left that indication. And the basic point is that these companies get a patent before they've got any idea if the compound they've got is going to cure anything. It's just a theory, a mode of action. But if we look at penicillin, the evidence was built up over time to show that that drug worked before there was any patent.
You raised a point when you touched on dementia, because dementia is part of my passion, what I've been researching for a long time. And yes, if that's what is the template, it's very frightening because in this context, where we've focused on an amyloid theory for 30 years, over 30 years, there hasn't been a single drug developed that could actually reverse the disease. The most they could do is slow it down a little bit. Yet the industry keeps on going down that road. And it has taken them over 30 years, and they're still doing it. So, based on that trajectory, could we have a situation where, even in the face of issues that need to be addressed, where we need to go back to the fundamentals of science, they will still do a similar pattern with regards to the mRNA technology, where there is just no stopping what they have to do? Is that where we are?
Oh, yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I tell you, I mentioned penicillin. If you go back to the days, 1928, Alexander Fleming, insulin, Banting, and others, Salk and polio vaccine, medically qualified people were at the center of drug development. They knew the indication, they were seeing patients day in, day out, and they were doing experiments in the laboratory and that whole thing. Today, we have scientists, in inverted commas, uh, doing this molecular modeling and saying, like, I think we've got a drug here. But, have you ever seen a patient? Have you been? Oh, no, 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 no. I'm sure the doctors will find out in 10 years' time when the drug comes out. We've got to bring physicians and doctors back into the front line of drug development. And that's what I've been preaching for the last 10 years, probably. And um, because it's going back to the time when it worked. There's nothing novel in this. Penicillin, the person who held the patent or the patent for penicillin when it was launched in 1941, 42 was at the US Department of Agriculture because he was an expert in the manufacture of moles. And Fleming found a mold, but he couldn't identify the active ingredient. Oxford University did that 11 years after he first found the mold. And they had to go to the US to find out how to make enough quantities to supply World War II. And only then, when the process was devised, did he get the patent. Today, you know, you can't, it doesn't make sense to patent to give a patent to a company who just got a molecule. It's like giving a patent to someone who's developing a car and they've only got a wheel or they've only got a chassis. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And so as we come to the close, Headley, I have said this over and over again. We are at a transition point in the whole scientific, medical, pharmaceutical industry where the public are starting to realize that the emperor has no clothes, that what was described as science was not actually science, it was opinion. And it wasn't backed with any clear clinical understanding of what was going on. And now the public is starting to realize what is happening. My big concern, don't fundamentally get back to this science extremely quickly. And even if we do it right now, I'm still not sure we can stop where we are, but we are still having circulating virus in highly vaccinated parts of the world, more and more Omicron variants that are developing cannot be right. How does the community, because this is going to impact everybody, scientists, medicine, pharmaceutical industry, is there any way that this can be reversed?
Hmm. Well, I've written about this. This is part of finding Violet Floggett, but um, the industry is equivalent to an addict, a gambling addict, and it's throwing its molecules on the roulette wheel of the industry, which is fast becoming Russian roulette, because you take 10,000 molecules, they're all patented, and one gets to market, and then you market the bones out of it to make the profit. So the first, like any addiction, you have to admit you've got a problem, and we have to tell the industry, the public, politicians particularly have to tell the industry you need to go into rehab, and then it needs support, particularly from the medical fraternity. There are certain medicines you cannot do without, the steroids, anesthetic gases. When there's a list, you know much better than I, but so we can't let the industry just fail. We've just got to exercise a containment process first, is to contain where we are so that there's as little damage as possible done while remediation plans are worked out. I think, as I say, physicians, doctors, medically qualified people need to be at the center of that, working with people like myself who understand what's been happening and understand how drugs traditionally over the last 40 years have developed, so that they have become safer and safer and more effective until they started to go the opposite way. And that's going to need people to put their heads together. And, politicians have got to be at the center of. I see, Senator Rand Paul in the US, who really is nailing it. He really is nailing it. He's a doctor. You've got Robert Kennedy Jr. again, who actually subscribes to my Substack. He is nailing it. We need to get people who really understand in positions of authority and power. And the Truth for Health Foundation, you kindly gave us an interview that went down really well not long ago, Philip. There are organizations that are fighting the battle, and they all need to get together and come up with a solution, basically. And I don't think it's beyond the wit of man.
Absolutely. Really appreciate. So just to remind everybody, this is again Inside Pharma. This is Hedley's Substack, and he deals with really big topics, takes them on, and he's not afraid to challenge the industry. And I think that in effect, he is probably right that we need different kinds of leaders and thinkers that are operational at different times now. The world is at a critical transition point. I am worried about. And I think that if we don't find solutions for the pandemic extremely quickly, the impact that this could have, not just on lives, not just on death, but also morbidity, people getting sick, but also on industries that, as you said, are essential to being able to deliver quality healthcare across the world. So, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you found this as interesting and informative as me. And until the next time, please look out for our presentations. Hedley, I'll ask you to stay with me while we do the outro. Have a great afternoon, everyone.